Preseason is over. The first game of the season is looming, and your favorite team's coach comes up at the press conference, and he welcomes everyone, and he says, well, this year, we have a pretty sorry team. Just got to be honest with you. And looking at the roster and really looking at my staff, I don't really know that we've got the ability to even be above 500. In fact, if we win a game, we're going to be pretty lucky. So I just want to set the expectations here at the beginning. Now, if you are a supporter of this team, especially if you have paid the money for season tickets, or if you have other pecuniary interest in the success of the team, that's not really what you want to hear from your team's coach at the beginning. But you also might think, for example, of there's been a presidential election, and January rolls around, and here's the inauguration, and the president comes forward and says essentially, because of unemployment and because of some various crises that have been going on in our country and a lack of infrastructure, and there are some pretty powerful nation states and even non-state actors that are a problem, and I've just got to tell you, if we make it through the next 4 years, we'll be doing pretty well, all right? No, if we hear these kinds of things, we hear that and we think, what's wrong here? We don't want to be around that. And I think as a general rule, whether it's in these kinds of, whether it's sports or whether it's politics and our nation's well-being, whether we think about families or churches, we want to be around positivity. We don't want to be around negative. And I think one of the reasons why is negative not only is an ineffective way to deal with real-world problems, but when we have a negative attitude and mindset, we defeat ourselves before we even get started. So what our lesson is going to be this morning is adopting and cultivating and choosing a positive attitude in the church's work. And I think it's clear to see the need for this kind of lesson, especially in our day and time. We need to be reminded of how powerful a positive attitude is and our need for a positive attitude. I don't have to tell you that we live absolutely in a world of negativity. I mean, when you turn on the news, it's clear that the news media is essentially, in part, an entertainment business, and that entertainment business runs on negativity. Because that's what gets our emotions aroused, that's what gets us to watch, and that's what gets us invested, is if we get mad at what's being said or what's being done or talked about in the news. But we can also see that on social media. There are some words that have come up in the last few decades that have become part, really, of our dictionaries. Words like flame, in terms of emails or texts that are sent, like flame mail. When you're really cutting someone down, and you really should have maybe at least paused for a minute before you hit send. But also when you look at social media, we have words now like trolling, or someone is a troll. And it's because that's a term for those who somehow get a kick out of stirring up disagreements and problems and animosity online. We live in a negative world. And part of that is because our society, at least in this country, has become increasingly polarizing. And so when you are exposed more, like we are now, to other viewpoints and other kinds of approaches, that's going to bring some conflict and thus some negativity. And so it's important for us in this world of negativity to try to fight against that. And kind of the question that we need to raise and that this lesson is addressing is, are we going to allow the church? And here I'm specifically talking about Grinnell, the Lord's church here at Grinnell. Are we going to allow ourselves to drown and to be rendered ineffective in negativity? Now, there's not one person, or there's not really anyone in particular I'm thinking about with this lesson. It's not that, oh yeah, I know so-and-so really needs to hear this. But this is true for all of God's people and all of God's churches throughout the world. But we want to focus it on us here at Grinnell. And there are really two different directions I want to think about when asking how we can avoid having the church drown in negativity. And there are two different directions I want to at least address with this lesson. If we're not careful, sometimes churches, especially those in rural areas, especially in areas where there is increasingly maybe churches or areas in which the population is getting older, or we don't see as many young people being part of the church, if we're not careful, a church can adopt kind of a defeatist mindset of, when that generation passes, where are the leaders in the church going to come from? Where are the members going to come from? I guess after a few funerals, I guess we'll be closing up the doors. I've heard this in churches. And that is a church in a community with some people in it. And maybe granted, yes, there are demographic or economic challenges that the church may face in a community. But as long as there's a community of people, there's no need for the church to have this kind of mindset of, we're going to be closing up the doors here in a generation or two. I guess we'll just come in and keep the lights on until that happens. Churches can adopt that mindset. I don't think it's here. But this lesson is to help keep it that way, to where we don't have that mindset. But there's another sense in which this lesson is needed to address another problem, and that is, oftentimes, just historically, traditionally, the Lord's church in this country in the past several decades has often been defined by what we're against. We don't support institutions with the church's money. We don't support churches. We don't believe in premillennialism. We don't believe in salvation by faith only. We don't drink. We don't dance. We don't cuss. We don't do all of this other stuff. And if we're not careful, we can leave the impression, especially on our young people and on those in the community, that what defines us is what we're not. No, the Lord's church is not no, 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 but in Him it is yes. The idea is that the Lord's people should be defined, identified, recognized, and be found appealing by what we stand for. We are positive. Salvation has come down for mankind. And by the Lord's grace, we have been taught that and we have found that. And we have a special message that is powerful, it's effective, and it changes people's lives, not for life now, but for the life to come. And there's every reason to be positive about that. And so, yes, there are things that the Lord's people must absolutely stand against and fight. That is a necessity. But that is not the story. That is not the end goal that we should view of. We're just fighters. We just got to really stamp out all this false doctrine and immorality. Yes, that is to be done, but in pursuit of the positive, optimistic goal that God would have all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. And that's what we should be like. And our tone and our attitude and our comportment also should reflect that kind of positive attitude. And so the way I want to address this is actually to go back to the book of Nehemiah in chapter 2. I'd like for us to consider the situation that Nehemiah found himself in, and Nehemiah's success in his work, to me, has a lot to do with the positive attitude that he took toward that work. So in our time this morning, first of all, I want us to clarify a little bit further what I mean by having a positive approach in the Lord's work. But then we want to turn most of our focus to Nehemiah chapter 2, looking through this chapter and seeing how Nehemiah brought a positive attitude toward his work and why that was successful with the Lord's help. And then finally, a few practical points, how we, like Nehemiah, can rise up and build. So first of all, I want to spend just a minute clarifying by what I mean with the word positive. Sometimes when we talk about people who are glass half empty, glass half full, we kind of portray and characterize the glass half full people as just kind of being like Pollyanna and just being blissfully ignorant about life's problems and just bumping along, just not being aware of issues. So when I say positive, I'm not saying we're blindly optimistic, that we're not aware of problems or some of the challenges that are there. No, being positive is not kind of closing up our ears or putting our head in the sand and pretending like everything is good, like we're all just going to hold hands and dance our way to heaven with no problems. No, we're not talking about that. Churches deal with problems. There are issues that come up in the community. Satan is at work. So we're not talking about that when we say positive. But what I mean by positive would be the following traits or words. Positive here is hopeful. That is, it looks beyond the present difficulties and it sees the end goal that is hopeful. Positive means confident, and it's not self-confidence, but is God-confident. Positive also means constructive. So positive doesn't mean that we don't criticize. Sometimes criticism is necessary. What we're saying here is that though the criticism is constructive, that is to say, I'm not simply trying to cut down or to bemoan whatever negative condition. I'm trying to build towards something that's good. And positive also means consistent. How many times have we ourselves or a group adopted some kind of noble goal, noble ideal, and we just head out the gates and we're gung-ho for it, but then the first setback, the first obstacle, we just throw our hands up and we stop. There's no good in continuing on. Let's just kind of slump back to the way we used to do it. No, being positive is being consistent. It's having principles, knowing what you're going for, and yes, there will be crosswinds, there will be adverse circumstances, but you plow right ahead with what your goal and your hope is. And all of these traits we see in Nehemiah chapter 2. So I want to turn then, and if you haven't turned there yet, let's get in our Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 2. Now, I want to say a few things about the setting of this chapter and read a few verses before we start drawing the applications. So Nehemiah and the book of Nehemiah talks about one of the massive returns of the Jewish people out of exile of Babylon back to Jerusalem. So you think about your history from the Old Testament and some of the history going on here. Around the year 606, 605, the Babylonian Empire first attacked Jerusalem. And so they deported some of the people. Then again, after about 10 years, they made another attack. And then a few years later, in around 585, they made a third and final attack, which destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the temple, and they ransacked the temple's goods and treasures, and they deported most of the people over to Babylon. Then a few years go by, counting 70 years from the first attack, and we get to the mid-530s when Cyrus, a Persian king, makes a decree that deported or captive peoples have the opportunity to go back and to rebuild their homelands, to restore their own worship. And we read about that also historically in Ezra chapter 1. Well, again, that happens around the year 535. Well, some decades go by, several years, and the Jews have returned to Jerusalem, but they haven't built the temple yet. They haven't finished it. They're living in nice houses. And so the Lord sent prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to spur the people on to finish the temple and get it rebuilt. Well, many more years go by, around 70 or so years, and now we have a second return. Ezra leads a group back. And as a priest, Ezra's mission is to restore the worship and to build up the spiritual vitality of the people once again. About 10 years later, we get Nehemiah, whose job is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and to secure Jerusalem as an autonomous state, yes, under Persian rule still, but a state, a city that is secure and protected from their adversaries in the region to where life can go on as the Lord would intend for that remnant. So, in short, there were 3 attacks on Jerusalem, 3 deportations, and then there were gradually 3 returns from that captivity, and Nehemiah is the third return then. We'll just quickly get the setting of Nehemiah. If you look in chapter 1, it says in verse 2, that Nehemiah writes from the first person, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So it's hard for us to really picture what this would have meant to Nehemiah and to the people of his time. Jerusalem, remember, was the special city that God had said, I will put my name here, and I will dwell with you, and I will dwell among you. And Jerusalem is going to be like the memorial city, that I have a special relationship with you as my people. And now because they had forsaken God and turned their back on him, he allowed this Gentile, uncircumcised nation to come in, and they burned so much of Jerusalem, destroyed much of the city, and the gates, the walls were broken down. And for an ancient city, the wall meant everything. It was not just protection and security, but that protection and security also facilitated trade, buying and selling. Like so much of the welfare of a people were bound up in having a good wall around it and having a functioning society. Nehemiah hears this, and it's not just a political, patriotic reaction, it is a spiritual reaction that he has to hearing that God's potential for this city has been left there in ruins by this people. So that's why he mourns. And so what happens then in chapter 2, we won't read all these verses, but he petitions the king. Let me go back with a contingent, and I will rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And because he had prayed to God and the Lord is with him, God allows the king allows Nehemiah to return. And we pick up then the story when Nehemiah and his group get there, beginning in chapter 2 and verse 11. So let's now read through the end of the chapter from Nehemiah 2:11, and then we'll draw some lessons from it. So Nehemiah 2 and verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me, except the one on which I rode. And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. And come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. So just as a quick recap, what Nehemiah and the others do, they get there and he says in verse 11, I was there 3 days. Now, if you've gone on a long journey, even if you've been in a car all day, you get home and the next day you're wiped, right? So the group takes some time to rest up. But also it's important that even though they're there 3 days, he has not yet told them fully what the mission is going to be. And we're going to explain why, I think, in a minute. But Nehemiah leaves and he takes just a handful of handpicked men. And he goes, and he doesn't have like a huge caravan with him. He's not making a big show of it, but he goes at night. And the idea is that he goes on an itinerary in and out of some of the remnants of the gates. He's surveying the damage. And he's kind of taking stock and scale of the task that's before him. But then when morning comes, he gathers everyone. And now that he has taken stock of the situation and he's got his feet set, he announces to them, look, Jerusalem is still in ruins. Its gates are burned. Its walls are broken down. We're going to fix this. And the people hear that and they say, yes, let's get up and let's build this. But then at the end of the chapter, we find that there are some of the Samaritans, the Arabs, and those kind of living around the territories of Jerusalem who absolutely do not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. These are God's enemies. And these were individuals that were exploiting the vacuum that Jerusalem had left. Jerusalem had been kind of an economic centerpiece of this territory. And so here were men that were taking advantage and were really financially better off by having Jerusalem in its position. They did not want to lose political or economic advantages by seeing Jerusalem rebuilt. And so they tried to intimidate and threaten, and Nehemiah shoos them away. He dismisses them. So with that, let's now think back through some of the steps here of how Nehemiah brought to this very difficult situation a positive attitude that was productive. Clearly here, this was a daunting task. As it was described in in chapter 1 that we just read, and in this section here was a situation where, yes, the walls were broken down, the gates were burned. That's a difficult task. But I want you to think about something. From the first attack and from the final deportation of the people, it had been about 140 years since Jerusalem had been put in this situation. 140 years. Multiple generations had come along, seen the job, and they left it and kicked the can down the road for someone else. They punted it down to the next generation. And generation after generation, here was a need, but it was just easier to get used to it. Can't we get like that sometimes in our personal lives, in congregations? We see things that need to get fixed, and if we just sit on our hands long enough, we get used to it. We get used to the bad. We get used to the unproductive. We get used to the lack of zeal. And that just becomes what we're used to. And so, how difficult is it, number one, to undertake such an extensive building job as this? But Nehemiah was also trying to push back a boulder and momentum that had been moving for so many generations. Previous generations had not even attempted the task. I want to say, in congregations, so much good work is often left undone simply for a want of trying. And yes, when you think of how can we evangelize and spread the news in this community, how are we going to do that? Especially if it's not been done for generations in a systematic, strategic, thoughtful, energetic way, it can be easy just to say, well, here's this job, but for want of trying, sometimes it doesn't get done. I understand Nehemiah had a difficult task. And so his positivity was not because it was easy. It was not because he saw the clear path to finishing this without obstacles. But positivity looks at a daunting task. And instead of saying, oh, we're never going to be discouraged, no, discouragement might come. But positivity says that we can take on even the most daunting of tasks with a godly attitude. Here's another point I want to get from chapter 2. Nehemiah took the time to plan and to deliberate on what he should do in the absence of negative people. It strikes me that he did not immediately go on a survey or a tour of the city. And I think if I can read between the lines a little bit, what may have happened with that, if we can do some speculation. Can you not imagine it would be like, look how terrible this portion of the wall is. I mean, its foundations are even undermined and eroded away. And this gate, think about all the manpower to clear the garbage out of the way, clear the debris. Where are we going to get the resources? In my view and reading of it, Nehemiah did this survey and tour of the city walls and gates so that people couldn't tell him what was wrong and what couldn't be done. He takes stock of the task. And just as a practical application here, negative people and negativity is contagious. And negative people are like parasites. You just need one in a group of people, and one bit of complaining starts, and then it's like, piranhas that you see on Discovery Channel. It's like a feeding frenzy. Like, okay, let's all just kind of vent our spleen about all the things that we're discontent about. And we complain, and we gripe, and we run down those who are actually trying to do something. Negativity is contagious. And one thing that we need to be aware of, number one, in a congregation of God's people, we have to make the decision, negativity will not start with me. If there becomes the contagion and a negative, kind of feeding frenzy here, it's not going to be me who's starting it. I need to decide that for myself. I can't, I'm not the boss of anyone else, and we're glad of that. We watch ourselves. We watch our own attitude. And I can make the decision for myself. I'm not going to have this negative attitude or run down others. Negative people drain energy, they drain enthusiasm, and there comes a point where both individually and as a congregation, there has to be the decision, we refuse to let that be the voice of the group. Just reject it. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be mean or harsh. It can be sometimes even just a comment to someone. Now, how is that constructive? How is that comment helpful? Is that building towards anything? You're just running them down. Or maybe we hear comments like, maybe there's been a proposition of, well, let's try this kind of method of reaching people. We tried that years ago and it didn't work. Man, we're just kind of this negative attitude. Sometimes we need to say, well, let's see if it can work now. All right, so let's say something and head off that kind of negativity. There is a need for calm, calculated thinking. And I think what we see in Nehemiah was not he didn't get there and then gather the people and say, all right, anyone got some ideas here? Like, how are we going to do this? No, the question was not, how could we ever do this? But Nehemiah's approach was essentially, this is getting done. Fact. Now, how are we going to do it? What's the first step? You see the change in thinking there? So many times, both we as Christians and are facing our own challenges, or as a group, we can sometimes just sit on our hands worrying about the size of the task, but we need someone to step up and to say, it's getting done. That's already been decided. Now, what's the first step in order to get it? But a third and kind of counterpoint to that was Nehemiah's positivity itself was contagious. Notice in verse 17, he gets up and he says, essentially, yeah, the situation is here. It's not good. Like the gates are burned, the city is lying in waste. But then notice what he then says in verse 17. He changes from a realistic view of the situation, and he says, let's get up and he says, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be a reproach. And then he went on to tell them about how God had blessed them. The king was behind what they were doing. And so Nehemiah was essentially the voice that finally stood up and said, we're going to do it. And we have the resources to do it. All right, we have the motivation, we have the ability, let's go get it. And the people then responded to that, yeah, let's rise up and build. As a general rule, a group of people or a community want to be positive and constructive. But sometimes we can let a negative atmosphere descend, and all it takes is one to kind of break through that and to say, hey, let's shake ourselves into some action here. Many times a group simply needs just one person, young or old, who will stand up, open their eyes to the opportunities and say, I'm going, who wants to go after there with me? The positivity was contagious. But also here we see a response to negativity. You see that in verse 19, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, like these are the bad guys that keep reappearing in Nehemiah. And so notice their tactics to stop the work. What is this thing that you are doing? The idea here is like, are you serious? Do you really think you're going to rebuild Jerusalem? And so there's an attempt to intimidate by the size of the task. But also, will you rebel against the king? You notice that was not so veiled a threat as if to say, we're going to report you. And we're going to say that you're trying to rebuild Jerusalem so you can have some kind of political, independence from the king. Where Nehemiah had face-to-face got permission from the king. The king had even sent resources and letters of recommendation so that Nehemiah could take advantage of some of the royal woodland and some of the other resources. And so Nehemiah knew that these were empty threats. And his response, what was it? Nehemiah was not distracted and did not take the time to go around trying to put out all of these fires and answer every single criticism. And I think it's important that, again, not just individually, but as a church, we don't have the time to go around and answer every critic. And there comes a point where it's important just block out the noise. All right, whatever the chatter is from the community or whatever the bad-mouthing is of others, just be focused and have blinders on and do the work that's before you, and your actions will do the speaking for you. And Nehemiah here, he simply dismissed it and he went on. He just simply said, God will make us to prosper. We're going to do it. You have no business here. Let's move on and work. And so it's an important lesson that Nehemiah was not dragged into and pulled into a battle that was not going to be productive. And we as churches need to realize that too. There are things that Satan will raise to distract us and problems that he will throw in to kind of get us off the main goal. And there comes a point where, yes, you got to deal with problems as they arise, but don't lose sight of what the main focus and job is. So, Grinnell, let's rise up and build. And I can say, at least for this congregation, knowing you, let's keep standing and let's keep building, would be my message to you. There's a lot of work to be done in this church. That's true of every church. There are things to learn from God's Word. There are the weak to build up. There are the strong to use their opportunities for good. So many opportunities in this congregation. There's a generation coming in which there can be deacons, there can be elders in the group if you keep planning, if you keep working toward that good goal. And there are opportunities not only in this church, but there's a lot of work to be done in this community as well. There are so many lost souls. You drive by house after house after house. You go by the college. You look at all of these people, and do you ever, as you go through, stop and think, does this person know the Lord? What kind of opportunities are here for that? There's so much work to be done. And the point that I'm trying to leave with this lesson is, we can choose the approach that we're going to work with. We can choose a negative, or we can choose a positive attitude. What does that choice look like? It's a choice that, insofar as I, as an individual, make, the church as a whole is closer to making these positive decisions. Negative looks only at problems. Positive sees both the problem and the solution. Negative delays. Positive acts. Negative sees shortcomings in others. Positive sees their strengths and how they can contribute in ways that no one else can. Negative complains. Positive encourages. Negative says, we've tried that before and we failed. No use. Positive says, let's try again. And this time, let's work harder and smarter. Negative focuses on self. Positive focuses on the group's best interest. Negative, when it doesn't get its way, pouts. Positive humbly acts in the best interest of the group, even if it wasn't your idea, or even if another decision was taken that you disagreed with. Not as a matter of truth, but as a matter of judgment. Negative pouts, positive humbly acts. Negative only listens to negative, filters out the positive and only hears negative. Positive ignores the noise and gets strength and energy from the positive encouragement of God's people. Negative is intimidated. Positive finds strength in God. We choose. I choose. That last point, positive finds strength in God. The theme that you see over and over and over, and I won't read all these verses with you, but in chapter 2, verse 4, 8, 12, 18, 20, he repeatedly either mentions the good hand of my God, or he directly attributes the success and the future hope of his mission to God. One of the themes of this chapter, and really for the story of Nehemiah, is that he consistently depended upon God for success and for strength, and he gave God the credit for it. And we must never lose sight of where the true source of our strength and success will be found, and it is in him up above. I want to close by looking with you back to Philippians chapter 2 that we began our service with a reading of, and I want to finish by reading this as kind of a rallying call and as the kind of closing pep talk to this lesson this morning. In Philippians chapter 2, let's begin reading in verse 12. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. That is exactly the point that I've been trying to leave with you this morning. Let's set aside the complaining, any disputing, the negativity, and how can we be blameless and harmless and shine in this community? If with positivity, hope in the Lord above, and with his might, we go about the great work that he set before us, and nothing will stand in our way of accomplishing the work that he wants us to accomplish. And he will see that the increase comes in his own good time. Thanks for listening this morning. And I encourage you to go ahead and take out your songbooks now and prepare to sing this last song that Arnold's going to lead us in. Certainly, if we can be of assistance to you, if you want to renew your zeal to God, if you wish for the prayers of this group, if you wish to inform us of any challenges that you are facing, that's the purpose of this song. And if we can be of help to you, if we can pray with you, then we'd encourage you to come, to make that known, and we'll do what we can to help you make things right with God while we sing together.